rights movement. Again, obviously, we've been kind of on the civil rights movement for a little while now. I gave you guys a kind of a stagnated movie break there so we could take a break from the notes. These will be the last notes that we have for the civil rights movement, and then we're moving on from it after the test. So we will have a test. I'll have you guys next Thursday? Yeah. So next Thursday, you'll have your test. Next Tuesday, we'll have a review day. And I think I told you this, but I won't be here next Thursday. Did I tell you guys that? So I'll be gone next Thursday, but you guys will have a sub. You'll take a test, and then I'll just leave notes on there that say basically give you guys the rest of the time to work on whatever you got to work on. Okay? Won't move on into any new material next week at all. It'll all be the same stuff. And then after that, I think the next thing that we do is more 60s stuff with Kennedy. I think we talk about Nixon maybe as well. And then I think there's one more person too, somewhere in there. I don't know if Reagan is talking, I don't know what it is, even though he's later on. Everybody's kind of clumped into the same thing for some reason. So maybe there's somebody else there that we talk about, but that's the next unit that we move on to. Today we're going to talk about Freedom Summer. We'll talk about Selma very shallowly because we've already watched the whole movie on it. On the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Talk about some racial violence. We'll talk about Malcolm X. Talk about the Black Power movement with Stokely Carmichael, which, side note, says the other class, it's a really cool name, Stokely Carmichael. I feel like people just don't have names like that anymore. There's some other names that pop up today, too, that are just I don't know, they just sound cool. Nowadays, it's like the new leader of the movement, Ted, right? Stokely Carmichael, it's kind of cool. You have the Black Panthers that we'll talk about, and then we have achievements and downfalls of the civil rights movement. It's important to note, the civil rights movement, though it has so many positive things tied to it and associated with it, it's not perfect. There's still things to this day that we're fighting to overcome. So we'll talk about a little bit of that at the end. To start, we have Freedom Summer, Mississippi, 1964. So this is before Selma. This is a movement to register African-American voters in Mississippi because no legislation had addressed voting laws. So there's an opening there. 5 counties, this is a big deal. 5 counties with African-American majorities had 0 registered African-American voters. Why is that, do you think? Yeah, but what is that? That's definitely it. But what's going on? Yeah.
Was the voucher thing?
Yeah.
At this time?
Yes. Yeah. Still had vouchers, right? So this is before Selma. We still got vouchers going on, and remember the big thing with that was yeah, you can be registered to vote, but you need somebody to vouch for you, right? And so with that, it's no white person is going to vouch for an African American, and it's not necessarily to say that it's all the people in there are, it's not like everybody there is racist. But even those who might be allies in the movement there, they recognize and they understand, should you be a white person and you are going to vouch for the first registered black voter, you're immediately in the eyes of somebody like the Klan, right? And it's a dangerous scenario for anybody. It would be a dangerous scenario for that registered voter, as we saw and they talked about in the movie, where it's yeah, if you're registered or you attempt to register, your address is posted and stuff. And it's just crazy, right? So that's part of the thing too. We had things like literacy tests, right, as well. Even if you could literally have a photographic memory of the entire state constitution, they'd find a way to make sure that an African-American voter did not qualify. And then with the vouchers, again, too, it's not like a black person can vouch for another black person to vote because they're not registered and they haven't been given the opportunity to. So again, this is a big thing, though, here as well. How are you going to root out systemic racism and institutionalized racism and racism in the government if you can't even vote, especially when you're an African-American majority in that district or that area? I mean, this is another reason why a lot of people in power, especially racist white people in power like George Wallace, it's why they're threatened by the black vote. It's a big thing because they know that as soon as African-Americans get the chance to vote, what's going to happen to people like George Wallace? Done, right? Good luck. Good luck maintaining your kind of, racist ideals in an area where there is a majority of African-American voters who, for the first time in their lives, are now allowed to vote. And you start to see a lot of that stuff after the Voting Rights Act happens. You have 1,000 student volunteers organized by the SNCC or SNCC, right? The 3 civil rights workers, though, there's still, even in these nonviolent things, even in something over, stuff that, you know, at least speaking from a privileged white person's perspective, something that I take for granted nowadays is my right to vote. I do. Sometimes I do. I mean, I still exercise it all the time, but it's something I myself have never really had to think twice about. It's just been always offered and available to me. But, you know, in this situation, we're looking at this and people are dying over this, right? People are dying over this right to vote. And there's a lot of violence enacted on, again, the nonviolent side is having a lot of violence enacted on them. So you have 3 civil rights workers disappearing and they're later found dead. You see this image up here. You also have another, also amazing name, Fannie Lou Hamer, spoke about voting violence and issues that come up with meeting voters attempting to gain their rights with violence themselves. Again, have you ever met anybody with as cool of a name as that? I feel like it's very rare. I don't know. Again, you know, it's me. My name's like Mark. That's just boring, right? I want to be Fannie. That sounds cool. Or Stokely. That's a pretty dope name. Anyways, you can see again famous kind of sentiment from Dr. King. We shall overcome. Something we saw in the movie. Something we see King says all the time. But either way, there's a lot of violence happening here, even against, you know, nonviolent things like Freedom Summer. Sullivan Montgomery. I won't talk too much about this because we watched it in the movie. But, you know, some of the stuff that we already covered. That pressure against the federal government, that's the big thing with the SCLC. MLK and the SCLC, also SNCC there as well with John Lewis, and I think his name is Hosea Williams. We have Bloody Sunday, right? Bloody Sunday is that first march that we saw. The one MLK wasn't there, but you have John Lewis leading that march, who later goes on to a lot of really kind of fantastic things in his career, especially in his civil rights career and his activism in politics as well. That is where authorities do all that kind of terrible stuff where it's a lot of police brutality there in that situation. And then following this, you have President Johnson calling for stronger federal voting legislation, finally getting that. Eventually, we get to the Voting Rights Act of 1965. This banned things like literacy tests and empowered the government to regulate voting. And then we also have the 24th Amendment, which bans that poll tax. And they said it in the movie, you know, poll taxes, and they're going over, and you can hear them kind of arguing with each other about what we need to target first. What's first on the agenda? One person's like, we need to target poll taxes first. You know, black people in this area are very poor. You know, they can't afford to pay the poll tax. And it wasn't just a poll tax of like, hey, you're voting for the first time this year, pay your one-time fee. They were also enacting all this like retroactive payments of like, you know, African Americans haven't been able to vote for however many years. In the case of like Jimmy Lee Jackson's father, who was like 84, they're telling Jimmy Lee Jackson's father, yeah, you want to vote? Well, you have to pay for all the years that you've been alive, basically, even though he hasn't been able to vote. And even though, you know, you have like reconstructive amendments coming around, he hasn't been able to vote. He hasn't been able to. Yet they want him to pay for all of those different years of voting that he has been technically eligible. So that is something that you see there as well. It targets definitely poor demographics, but even people who have some money probably wouldn't be able to afford something like that. But either way, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, that's kind of striking that down on a federal level. So that gives the government the ability to kind of go into areas like Selma and force people like George Wallace to allow African Americans to vote without obstruction. We have Malcolm X. He is an African American minister of Islam and human rights activist. It's always interesting, again, to see how religion ties into the civil rights movement. It is not always Christianity, though that is what we cover most of the time because MLK is tied to Christianity as well. But Islam is also important. It's especially important to, you know, a lot of African Americans because it has Islam has roots in the slave kind of history of many African Americans. With the what originally happened was African Muslims were brought here over during the slave trade, and that is where Islam kind of finds its roots in the African American community. And so that's why you kind of, and it's not always the reason why, but maybe it's part of the reason why, you know, individuals like Malcolm X and people like Muhammad Ali kind of go forth and kind of adopt this different kind of religion, right? So with that too, the Nation of Islam, they have obviously different goals and ideas than MLK. Nation of Islam sees, they see the white supremacy that's happening across the nation, and they meet that with their own kind of counteracting ideas of black supremacy as well. And it's less of a, MLK's movement is a lot about unity. It's about unifying the nation, healing, right? Bringing all the people together, everybody from all walks of life. King and his principles of nonviolence says specifically, I don't want to fight hate with hate. I want to fight it with love, right? Which is not, and understandably so, I think, not to advocate violence in any way, but it does not surprise me in the slightest that there is a sect of people or a sect of African Americans who are not interested really in the nonviolent movement, given all the stuff that we've seen, right? I've said it before, it's a difficult ask of King, and he knows this, and I think he knows this, that it's difficult to ask his followers to, sit in the face of racism and violence and not rise up and meet it with a similar tone of violence as well.
So I'm assuming those two didn't get along.
Honestly, not for the longest time. But you can even see in Selma when we saw that there's that kind of scene where Malcolm X comes through and he talks to Coretta, MLK's wife, and it's this weird kind of situation that Malcolm X goes through where he's in this vein of thinking so differently from MLK and his movement for such a long time, and so they do go back and forth a little bit in many ways. But I think King still recognized him as a civil rights, a member of the civil rights movement, and is somebody important to many people. So he does reference Malcolm X a couple of times, even in that movie that we watched, but it's really kind of a post-pilgrimage where Malcolm X and King are a little bit more on the same page, right? So it's not always this way. Malcolm X actually goes to Mecca. Does anybody know what Mecca is? It's basically like the end all for like the most important place in the religion of Islam, right? So Malcolm X makes a pilgrimage there, a religious kind of, journey to Mecca. And in Mecca, he understands and kind of develops a more authentic sense of what Islam is to him. And he starts to come around to this idea of unification. He starts to come around to this idea of nonviolence a bit. But the tragic thing with that is, as amazing as Malcolm X's life was, he just like MLK is taken, at a relatively young age. I think MLK died when he was 39. I don't know exactly how old Malcolm X was when he passed away, but he was assassinated in 65. So to answer your question, yeah, they didn't really get along for a decent amount of time, but Malcolm X started to come around eventually to some different ideas of nonviolence. And before he really got a chance to expand upon that, he was actually assassinated by members of the Nation of Islam. At least 3 guys, I think, were involved in the plot. Only one of them admitted to it. But what happens here is he leaves the Nation of Islam because he's no longer on board with some of the ideas of separation, some of the ideas of maybe supremacy of a race, right? He's no longer with that, and so he's starting to kind of turn a new page, and that is when he's assassinated. And one of the reasons why they probably didn't get along so well is because Malcolm X is in the vein of promoting things like any means necessary, right? Which is exactly what it sounds like. Malcolm X okay with meeting violence with violence, right? MLK, on the other hand, not necessarily in the same boat there. We do have a lot of racial violence still happening during this time, and obviously even to this day. We have things like race riots, anger over continued discrimination leading to riots in cities across America. We have things like violence, we have looting, we have arson, right? Los Angeles, California, Detroit, Michigan, Newark, New Jersey. There's just a lot of damage kind of happening all around. People are outraged, rightfully so, in the vein of, about a lot of this discrimination. It's not going away, and it's not going to go away for a long time. And even now, to this day, there's still heavy discrimination in many ways, right? So, and one of the things too is following MLK's assassination, following Malcolm X's assassination, though this might not entirely line up, you do see stuff like this because there's less structure. There's not the person to look up to for leadership, right? And it's really almost impossible to fill the hole that somebody like Martin Luther King Jr. leaves in the civil rights movement. And even then, it doesn't really have the chance to continue too much through his family during the time because they're probably traumatized by that whole thing anyway. And then you have his mother assassinated I think 13 years later after MLK is assassinated. It's just kind of a crazy time of calamity. We have the Kerner Commission is coming through. They say, yeah, all of this stuff is happening. Yes, there's riots. Yes, there's looting. Of course, there's arson and damage and looting buildings and stuff's on fire. But the reason this is happening, the underlying cause, the Kerner Commission comes out and says, well, it's because of the discrimination that's happening. There's no other cause besides the fact that people are outraged with discrimination. And the Kerner Commission also comes out and says that they fear that the United States is moving towards a world of two separate societies, one of black and one of white, instead of moving in the direction of unification. So this is maybe one of those warnings that they kind of issued. Here's some more images. And, you know, just like what we see nowadays, too, with any sort of protesting, you always have not always, but, you know, there's always there's often the situation where you can have somebody who's peacefully protesting, and then you have a different, usually minority, smaller group of individuals that are, like, not in the majority of the crowd, but are, you know, maybe enacting in something like this. And so there were probably people there that were peacefully protesting, but at the same time, the way that these things are handled, it wouldn't surprise me if people who are peaceful get caught up in the act of those who are not as peaceful, and a, you know, blanket kind of meeting with force. We also have racial violence in urban cities. You know, new groups emerging in urban cities. Some African Americans were tired of waiting and believed it was time to fight physically or be more forceful for rights. And I said this before, but it does not surprise me, right? It's a very difficult thing to lead a nonviolent movement. You see it in the movie, too, when everybody gets kind of beat on the Edmund Pettus Bridge and they're running back. The first kind of reaction of a couple of those guys is like, hey, man, like, where's your guns? Where are your guns at? Like, what can we do? And then it takes the other guy in the movement to talk them down and say, like, hey, what are you really going to do with that? What change will you make, right? But at the same time, you know, it does not surprise me that people are outraged, and it does not surprise me that people are tired of nonviolence. It's a difficult thing to go with. You have people like Malcolm X, you have the Black Power movement, you have Black Panthers, right? With Black Power, this is where your guy Stokely Carmichael comes in, Mississippi, 1966. He's the leader of the SNCC, but he starts to change its principles and its direction. Following Selma, following the Voting Rights Act of 1965, Stokely Carmichael sees and understands that African Americans have this newfound kind of political power. And what's left there is to organize. So Stokely Carmichael wants them to use economic and political power to gain equality. And it says there, whites felt threatened. Of course, you know, people like George Wallace in charge of areas where the black vote could definitely oust him from his seat, no doubt they'd feel threatened, right? They could lose their job. So that's where you get a lot of that resistance is coming from. And then you also see people like, oh no, there's real political change that can come and happen here. So, you know, positive things that you and I see, but if you're somebody who is probably racist and in charge of an area in government, and you're worried about that, and you're pro-segregation, you're pro-discrimination, you're probably shaking in your boots a little bit. And then on a side note, even kind of a sad kind of callback to something that we talked about before, but James Meredith, the guy who helped desegregate Ole Miss, he's actually murdered by white supremacists on a Mississippi march. So again, even when you get into these institutions, when you make that change, you know, this is such a crazy situation in general, but like, it's dangerous. You know, even when you do have those wins, you know, MLK has had many wins throughout his lifetime, and even then, he still met his demise at the hands of somebody who was holding a gun. And the same thing happens here with James Meredith. So that's why I always try and pay a little bit of tribute to many of these men and women, because it's just incredibly brave that anybody was involved in this at all. You know, it's just a really kind of amazing sequence of history. In this is a statement from Stokely Carmichael. Integration has been based on complete acceptance of the fact that in order to have decent house or education, blacks must move into a white neighborhood or send their children to a white school. This reinforces the notion that white is automatically better and black is by definition inferior. And that makes sense. I think it's a very good quote. You know, African Americans are tired of being told, like, yeah, just move in, move. You're not where the good stuff is, right? Like, get to where the good stuff is. Move into a white neighborhood, right? Because even at this time, there's still segregation. There's still issues of, some de jure segregation still happening here. Not as much as before, but there's still de jure segregation. There's still redlining. There's still realtors not allowing African Americans into white neighborhoods. There's still, the issue of like, why is it that African Americans need to go to all white schools in order to get equality, right? Like, it doesn't necessarily need to be that way. And I think that what Stokely's saying here is that by saying one needs to move into the other, one needs to integrate with the other, instead of making it a mutual decision, kind of a mutual thing, then you're automatically giving, whoever has to move to where is automatically being given this idea of, superiority. And that's not how we move forward at all. Just as a side note, 1968 Summer Olympics, Tommy Smith and John Carlos raised gloved fists in protest against discrimination. This is really actually important, more so, even though it's a small part of our notes today. This is a huge thing because what is it about the Olympics? It's the world, right? And this has been primarily something that we're seeing. It's not that racism doesn't exist across the rest of the world, but it's been a significant problem in the United States for some time. And to see this kind of, show again, this is kind of the symbol of like the Black Power symbol, right? Like standing in solidarity on such a like worldwide level is it's amazing, right? It's really kind of cool to see. And also just like, it's just a really, and then to do it in the platform of being, of being awarded like medals is on top of that is just the kind of icing on the cake. We have the Black Panthers, California, 1966. This is an organization of young militant African Americans who fought for rights. They had things like armed patrols to protect people from police brutality. They felt they needed defense, right? They needed to fight back. They have a 10-point program to support Black communities, so some community work there as well. They wanted, more than anything, self-defense by guns if necessary. And then on top of that, probably relying back on some of the things that you see with the beliefs of Islam and the Nation of Islam and some of those things that go on there, they wanted to be exempt from military. So no, it's what you would call a conscientious objector. If it's not in their religion or whatever, what have you, there is not the draft that could be used towards them. So with that becomes obviously especially important when we get to things like Vietnam too. And, a lot of these people don't want to go off and fight for a country which actively discriminates against them on like a day-to-day basis. So that is part of it as well. They often encountered violent confrontation with the police. You have these guys, Huey Newton, Bobby Seale. They are the founders of the Black Panther Party. They founded it after Malcolm X passed away. I don't know if that played a role, considering somebody from the Nation of Islam is responsible for murdering Malcolm X, but it might have. It's an ever-evolving movement. The civil rights movement is not static by any means. It is often dynamic and changing, and this is just one of the evolutions that it goes through. We have the MLK assassination. He's assassinated by James Earl Ray. James Earl Ray is a white ex-convict. MLK was actually speaking to Reverend Jesse Jackson on his balcony of this hotel. As he's speaking, James Earl Ray shoots him once, and that is all it takes. One bullet, I believe it was to the neck. So much force so that it actually knocked MLK to the ground. It blew his like ascot or necktie off or whatever he was wearing, and he went unconscious. And I believe he died an hour later. MLK was 39 years old. The civil rights movement was not over, right? And with MLK in charge, it was really gaining some serious momentum at the time of his assassination. Crazy thing is, following MLK's death, the coroner did an autopsy on him. They found that MLK had the heart of a 60-year-old man, yet MLK himself was only 39. And they attributed a lot of that to obviously MLK did not have the best diet in the world. But at the same time, and that plays a role a bit, but they also attributed a lot of it to the stress of the civil rights movement that he was under for like the past 13 years. So let that be a lesson to you all. Even though his heart is not what got to him, and instead it was, you know, a racist white ex-convict with a gun, your stress levels and things like that matter. Because that's something that inevitably probably would have caught up with MLK had he lived to be older than the age of 39. I can't imagine it wouldn't have been something down the road. So it's just kind of interesting to see that too. It's an interesting aside. Riots break out across cities in America. We have the 1968 Civil Rights Act, the Fair Housing Act, which is really, really important. It is probably the second most important thing behind voting rights would be fair housing, achieving something like that. And it is passed shortly after King's death. Like I said before, with King passing away, with Malcolm X passing away, even if you're somebody in this movement and you're not on the maybe more militant side of it with the Black Panthers, did you miss one?
No.
Okay. Even if you're not on the more militant side of it, maybe you're on the nonviolent side, whatever you might be, these are two incredibly prominent figures who have been leading the civil rights movement for some years now, who have passed away in short succession. It is devastating for the movement. It is absolutely devastating. Who knows how much more progress would have been done if King had lived to be a little bit older. Either way, it's not the end, right? But it does lead to a lot of disorganization. The NAACP set out to challenge the constitutionality of segregation. You have this guy, Thurgood Marshall. Does anybody know him? Anybody know what he's famous for? Besides this? Anybody ever heard that name? Another amazing name, by the way, Thurgood Marshall. Thurgood Marshall is the first Black Supreme Court justice. He has an amazing law career. He's an American lawyer who leads the NAACP legal team. He's got a couple of court cases that are pretty important, like Sweat v. Painter. Supreme Court ruled that Texas had violated the 14th Amendment by establishing a separate but not equal all blacks law school. Then you have McLaurin versus Oklahoma State Regents, ruled that the state had violated McLaurin's constitutional rights. He was admitted to the grad school of University of Oklahoma, but he was denied equal access to things like the library, the dining hall, classrooms. So they're looking at this and they're like, okay, well, hey, I hope you guys understand that admittance isn't what makes this equal. Just because somebody's admitted to your school doesn't mean that you've given them an equal opportunity. It gets down to facilities as well. So championing a lot of different things that are positive for the civil rights movement here as well. And probably most importantly, getting rid of a lot of the de jure segregation. If you remember, de jure is by law, de facto is by fact, which is more like by social institutes. So getting rid of a lot of that legalized racism. He increased participation in the political process. You had somebody to look up to, right? Those of you who know how powerful the Supreme Court is, the fact that somebody is a proponent of the civil rights movement, let alone being the first African-American Supreme Court justice, to have your foot in the door, to have somebody who represents you in that room with the rest of the Supreme Court, that's a huge thing, right? That's a huge victory. And on top of that, it is, again, just something for people to look up to as well. He goes through, he kind of deals with things like voting rights, he deals with housing rights, he deals with employee rights, and he does what he can in his position. We do have some downfalls, and this is the last slide here. Obviously, racism has remained. You know, there is a gap between whites and blacks remaining as well. Gaps as in like economic, gaps as in like academic even, opportunity gaps here as well. There's some controversy about government programs to close the gap. That is something that you see always talked about too, probably in the vein of like scholarships and things of that nature. And then also, like I said, the assassination of prominent leaders, you know, MLK, Malcolm X, some others as well. Even the woman who was helping MLK in the movie where she was assassinated like 5 hours after his speech in Selma, you know, that keeps happening. And when that happens, when these prominent people are assassinated, taken away, it loses some of the focus of the civil rights movement. It becomes less structured. And then still, again, even to this day, issues of de facto segregation, things like redlining, things like, institutionalized racism, stuff like that, right? Institutionalized discrimination. These are all things that you see, okay? So that is all I have for you guys today. Other than that, I will tell you as well, make sure that you go, and I'll go back to that if somebody missed anything, but make sure you go to the Unit 11 practice test, and you can try this one out. So what you do when you click on this, it's ungraded, so don't worry too much if you mess up. It is 10 attempts on there. If I preview it, you can get, I think there's 25 questions. So if you go through, it's all multiple choice, but this will be a good way for you to practice. All right. So try and take it at least once. And then if you have not finished your civil rights project, make sure that you do that as well. All right. Does anybody have any questions about anything?